Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone for joining. It's great to see the turnout. Um, the presentation is really focused around people that are maybe new to mobile, um, coming from web or a desktop platform. And I'm hoping this will help you bridge the gap as you uh, are maybe starting out or fairly new to the area, but I'm also hoping it can provide some benefits to existing mobile designers as well. That being said, the level will not be too sophisticated, just to cater to the larger group. I decided to put this on after having quite a few sessions with people and noticed that there might be um, a benefit to put something like this together. Um, I'm a systems slash framework designer at Microsoft. I work on the Microsoft Teams mobile app. What I primarily do is work on things like mobile IA navigation. I work a lot with engineers as well, just to review components that are maybe reusable, things like accessibility, and also work heavily with feature teams to um, just make sure designs are in harmony with the rest of the app. So I will share my screen with that intro, and I'll wait again till the end for maybe Q&A. I'll leave about 5 minutes or so, and I will try to keep these fairly concise, maybe end uh, about 25 minutes to give you back some time before the day ends. Um, Quick reminder: if your mic is open, maybe just mute it while this starts, just to avoid any echoing for people. And I'm dropping another link in the chat for the Figma presentation. So with that, I will share my screen now. Let me know if you can all see my screen, maybe in the chat. An okay or yes is good. Okay, awesome. So yeah, like I mentioned, the presentation is really just to help people transition over from web to from web desktop or other platforms. Hopefully, also help you communicate better with engineers, so that you can have a better collaboration process, and also just understand some of the thinking on their side as well, and just to highlight questions that you may or may not know, and maybe provide some answers there as well. So the agenda, I will go over some um, principles of mobile thinking that you would want to keep in mind as you're going through your product design. I'll mention some accessibility, provide some resources, and then also go into designing for multiple screens. Things like adaptive layouts and also measurements, which is fairly different from web and desktop. I'll talk a little bit about the technologies. Won't go too deep into that, but just some uh, high-level thinking that will help you make decisions and evaluate your designs, and then some key takeaways at the end. Um, Disclaimer: none of these designs are real. I made them specifically for this presentation, but they're there to aid the some of the descriptions here in the slides. So um, to start with, we'll talk about navigation for some bit. So coming from web or desktop, it's quite normal to have a navigation tab at the top, or like if you have a hamburger menu, sometimes in top left, most times in top left or top right. One of the major differences when coming to mobile is trying to transition into this idea of a navigation tree and tab navigation in the bottom section. This is something that is consistent between iOS and Android. And the best way to think about it is that your tabs are essentially the beginning of your navigation tree. I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. And then second, I'll also explain the concept of push versus modal. So on this slide here, uh, I'll, I've I've created this diagram to share what a push navigation might be, and then also what a modal experience might be. We're all familiar with modals, typically like a pop-up on web or desktop. Sometimes that might have a close button. Sometimes it might be nested with a back button. On mobile, it is fairly the same. The only difference is sometimes it also appears as a sheet, a bottom sheet that slides up to the top sometimes and can also become a full screen modal. Um, the word modal can then be deceiving because it's taken up your full screen, but the idea is that it's a temporary screen to accommodate a quick uh, a quick action or a quick flow, something like a checkout if it's not too long, or even some more complex flows if you are going to nest inside of the modal. Um, some of the reasons we use it on mobile is to uh, keep the user in the context of their page before, maybe their tab, for example, and then allow them to quickly complete an action inside of that modal. On things like tablet, it might scale to be a pop-up modal. Modals are like overlays, just keeping an eye on the chat here. So yeah, just like how you would see a pop-up overlay on desktop. So here we have the tabs for this app. In this previous screen, you can see this app is maybe some sort of a sports app that you might collect shoes, for example. And over here, I've created a news tab, a trade-in tab that you might want to trade a shoe that you've saved with other people. You might see a find icon, and then the find icon might be the flow to maybe find a particular shoe. And then you might have your vault, which is an area that you will save things. So I've expanded that a bit more here. So in that news section, if we're thinking about your tab being the top of your navigation tree, on desktop, these have a potential to be all nested under a hamburger menu. On mobile, there's heavy guidance from Apple and also material to really expand. And some of the reasons for that is to enable state retention. If you're not familiar with what state retention is, an example would be to select news, maybe navigate to an L2 of news, and keep that state while changing tabs to trade, for example. Benefits of that is that I can compare workloads within a particular session. So if I'm a shoe enthusiast, I select the find tab, I find my favorite shoe, and I decide, hey, I actually want to go read a little bit about that shoe. So I change over to the news tab. And by doing that, I can retain the state of the L2 and find. And this just helps the user navigate a lot more quickly because you don't have that affordance of being able to quickly move around with your mouse and hover and do all these other interactions that you have on desktop. Along with that, you are going to be in harmony with all the other apps on mobile, essentially, where the user is already familiar with how to navigate between the start of these workflows. So in the news app here, I may want to filter by a league, for example. I may want to go into an L2 of that. And then I might be presented with the teams under that league, and then eventually the player, and then a details section of that player where I can find their particular shoe, for example, and maybe save that to my vault. In the trade section, this might be where I have a watch list for different people, and maybe keep a watch list for when they might want to put their shoe on sale. In the shoe details, you can see here it's represented by a circle, which is a modal experience. There's a benefit here because I can then have that modal experience be available across different workloads. So whether I'm in news, trade, or the vault, I can have a modal experience that I don't have to rebuild every single time for each page. It's something that can be an overlay across different workloads. So there's some benefit there in At times also helps to keep your application small or smaller. So the in the find workload, similar to the news, you'll notice a trend here a lot about filtering what makes sense on a high level. If my end goal is to view a shoe or find a detailed shoe or from a player, maybe a famous player, I'd want to work back up to like the team and then the league, and then it's eventually end up on the find. And then same thing with the brands. Maybe I want to filter down with the brands and go on L2s. So as I drill down into these levels, drilling down is referred to as a push experience on mobile. Um, a modal experience is really just a modal, and they come with specific affordances where a push experience is usually just to traverse across the app. So you would go from left to right, and you would typically have a back button in your navigation. The modal usually animates from bottom to top, and sometimes that might take over the entire screen. You might have some affordance that you can drag it down by not taking over the entire screen, leaving a little bit of space at the top. And sometimes it might even start out as a half screen. So these are two really important principles to understand when designing for mobile, just the differences between push and modal. I'd really recommend everybody to sort of lay out their navigation and plan it this way so you can understand um, just how you would be traversing across content, when you need to maybe share in modal experiences across workloads, and also just to be really apparent about uh, when you start to nest a little bit too deep in a particular workflow. I'm sure we've all heard that rule of thumb of try and get into everything within 2 taps or 2 clicks. Laying things out this way will get you there very quickly, and even help you, reassess your navigation to make sure it's the right workload. And takeaway just from here is to understand that the news, trade, find, these tab sections are just the top of the workload within the app. Usually within a company, these might be different feature teams where you have the news feature teams, you might have the trade feature team, you might also have search feature team. So they are broken down that way. I'll move on here to the next slide where we are maybe start thinking about localization in large text. This one is extremely important, especially in the mobile setting, just because we have very limited real estate to work with. I'm noticing on the chat, I think people may be having some issues with following the slides. Thank you, Joe. I just posted the link again in the chat. Right now, I'm on mobile key factors, localization and large text. There may just be a lag in the screen sharing. So getting back to the slides, with localization and large text, this is something, especially if you're working in an organization with customers, maybe mid to large size, or even in your startup environments, you will likely have customers in different locations. So maybe people in Europe and in the EMEA region, and you will have to make sure that your app will be localized in their environment. And this is an example just for a visual. You can see how ad might be translated to German or French. And the key thing to look at here is how much the character count can increase. When we look in the context of a component, you can see that components can start to break very quickly. I'm on the next slide here for those that might be having lagging issues. So you can see how the button here will need some space to expand. This can affect quite a bit, especially if you put it inside of something like a card, or if you have a button that is more than 2 words. And this goes back to working with content design within your organization to make sure that you have the most concise but impactful CTAs across the app for situations just like this. When you factor in large text, you start to get components that could completely break and break the flow of user experience. Um, when you have CTAs, for example, that are essential to continue the next flow, we can see here a by item being translated, and then maybe in the larger screen, maybe in the English, it's still okay in localization. But as soon as you do translate it, sorry, English might still be okay in large text, but as soon as you translate it, you can see that these don't do so well. And that's why we really want to keep in mind and work way beforehand with the content team to make sure that our CTAs are appropriate and even maybe short descriptions or warnings. I'm going to move on here to examples where we may find that. I'm on UI examples at the moment, again, just for people following through the prototype link. Here we have the app bar, segmented tabs, fabs, which are floating action buttons, pills, and then cards. In the pill example slide here, I'm showing what that might look like when you have, you know, pills that maybe need to be translated. You might have enough space in the English format, but as soon as you translate it, you can see how 3 pills can become 2.5. And when you're on a product team, especially when you're working with product managers, and maybe you're trying to measure the long-term success of that particular feature or product, you'll often go over telemetry of whether things are discoverable, whether there's a fall-off rate within filtering, and some of that will lead you to evaluate whether you need to be using tabs like this. I think someone is off mute. Just a quick reminder to mute if you are unmuted. Maybe admin, if you're able to mute your mic. Okay, so you can see here, if this is a very important feature and we need customers or users to get to the other layers of this filtering, using a scrollable pill format like this might become inappropriate, especially when you start thinking about customers in different regions. And that's where things like localization and large text can really start to affect your bottom line if these things are important. It's always best to think about these upfront and then maybe reevaluate how you are filtering or whether you want to expand more on the tab that you are to avoid nesting things inside of tabs or pills like this. So moving on to accessibility here. These I'll just go over really quick just because they are things you can always look up. So we have touch targets. On Android, it's 48. On iOS, it is 44. Generally, it's just a safe area to allow users to be able to select action items without having too much trouble. Typically, between action items, you would want to keep a spacing of 8. And when I say 8, referring to 8dp, which is the mobile measurement. I'll go into the measurement here in a little bit. It is quite intense, so I'll save quite a bit of time for that. Also making sure things are readable, abbreviations, trying to avoid that when you can, making sure things are predictable. So this goes back to how you want to structure your navigation, how you want to maybe think about filtering and think about discoverability, things like that. Input button behavior. One thing I see often, especially if your design system is new or you still have a mix of design patterns, cards may sometimes be actionable, sometimes it may not be. So really thinking about how you're creating affordance for something to be actionable and therefore predictable throughout the life cycle of your application. Making things operable. So this goes back to accessibility. It's becoming more and more of a requirement these days, especially if you work in an organization that has a bank as a customer, for example. Their accessibility standards are really high, and there are requirements where people will need to plug in an assistive keyboard, for example, or even just mount it on a device where it's always stuck to landscape mode. Um, and you would need to make sure that you're scaling for these things early in the design, because what may happen is it goes off to engineering and they're not able to, it becomes tech debt essentially. So here are some resources just to keep things honest. WCAG is sort of like the golden area. It's what gets referenced in things like litigation, or um, it gets referenced in lawsuits essentially. The Apple HIG, this is a heuristics based on uh, studies that Apple have done and giving you the best practices for designing on Apple essentially, and also just mobile in general. Google Materials and Android equivalent. So you can Google these. It's usually just the first thing when you do look into them. And I'll move on now to devices and adaptive layouts. Again, just for anyone that is following on screen share or the prototype. This one is a bit in depth, so I'll try to keep it fairly light. On this slide here, you'll see it can get a little bit complex, but stick with me. I'll try to present it in a without all the complexities if this is your first time on this topic. So achieving essentially pixel independence is referring to devices that have different levels of resolution, but keeping your UI in the right ratio for usability. So here are some key terms here just to help you in the next couple slides. So display size is referring to the physical dimension. Example is maybe a monitor might be 27-inch. When you go to mobile, there are quite a number of devices, especially when you get into Android. Display resolution is referring to the total number of pixels in a display. An example of that is on a 4K monitor, you might see that it has 3,840 pixels by 2,160 vertical. So this is usually what we mean by display resolution. With pixel density, this is referring to the number of pixels per inch. And an example of that is in a 4K device, you might see that it has 183.58 pixels per inch. DP is the measurement that we use on mobile as opposed to pixels. And this lets us keep things in ratio across devices, and whether you're in mobile or going up to tablet. So in this screen here, pixel density, it's an illustration of essentially what's happening. And this is very important to be able to collaborate with your engineers so that you end up with the desired experience more often than not. You will still have to go through things like QA, but not accounting for this can result in very, very different outcomes. So with pixel density, you can see here that the red/orange box is illustrated in inch. The white boxes are illustrated in pixels. When we say pixels per inch, it's referring to how many pixels are inside a particular display screen per inch. In a higher resolution device, you can see here that these two are the same size. There are more pixels in this device per inch. So that's what we mean by a higher resolution or higher density device. When this goes over to tablet, even though it's the same, even though the screen is physically larger, you can see that they share actually the same pixel density. Depending on the product that you're designing for, if you're designing for a screen that maybe always viewed at 10 feet away, you will want to cater for that by increasing the default value of your designs. In Figma, when we're designing for these, or if you're working in XD or another platform, we work in a space where 1 pixel is equal to 1 dp. And all that means is that in Figma, you can be safe that whatever you show on the screen will scale across devices as long as you apply the DP measurement. Here's another illustration. So you have here an icon that's being shown on a lower resolution or lower density device. You can see here that same icon when it has not been converted to DP. If this is implemented, or if you're passing this off to an engineer, and you might say this is just for kicks, we'll say it's 24 pixels. When it's showing on the higher density device, we'll see that it actually gets smaller. And the reason it gets smaller is that 24 pixels here is taking up much less real estate on this device because there are a lot more pixels. Here's another illustration here on the right if we were to apply the DP measurement to something. So if you hand off this icon to an engineer and you say, hey, this is actually 24 DP, there will be some calculation on the device's end to make sure that it scales proportionally in context to the screen width. And this is why DP is extremely important, especially as you start getting into other devices, whether it be tablet, maybe a Facebook portal, for example, which have different density levels of density. And usually they will come from the manufacturer and you can get this information also on their resources website to make sure that you're designing in the right pixel density inside of your Figma space. So this is a bit of a beefy one. I will, like I said, I'll leave questions a little bit to the end, but I can also take some of these in maybe some one-on-one sessions later if there is some confusion. But there's a ton of info on this on the web as well that you can find in the Google Material resources. I find they do an especially good job of explaining it. But this is one thing that comes up over and over again within your product team if you're on a mobile product team or you're transitioning over. So really important to understand what's happening in here. So in this next screen, I'm going to talk a little bit about the technologies and some of the benefits of going native versus using something like React Native or another framework. Some of the benefits of using native is that you get a lot of OS controls for free. And what this means is, for example, if we go back to that tab example, OS already gives you a framework to create tab navigation. All that's needed is to just populate that component with your attributes, which I'll show here a little bit later, and then you get also accessibility actions for free. This is referring to things like focus order and what gets read out by the screen reader when a maybe non-sighted user is going through it. You also get upgrades and support for free. As we've seen, iOS just recently upgraded their OS, and same with Material. You notice Material has a lot of more rounded corners now. If you haven't actually been looking at the news updates, but you've probably seen Gmail with their more rounded corners. And by using the native components that are available, any improvement in accessibility is an improvement for your product, which is then passed on to the user. There are some cases where you might want to do a hybrid, especially if you have a service that is maybe web-based and you're showing that as a web embedded view within your product. There might be also services that are React Native within a company that are being maintained by one core team to service both platforms. So these are areas where you might see a hybrid experience. What are some of the differences, at least to you as a designer when designing for native? Like I mentioned in the tab experience, this is a typical tab component that is provided to us by OS. There are benefits here that when you get into tablet, for example, there's been more of a push recently to have things be adaptive, and the preferred layout is to have your bottom tabs on the left side of your tablet device. Um, both platforms now are also making their application accessible within a desktop environment. So you can imagine taking having the benefits for free of having your app be adaptive by just applying these traits within the provided components and having your app just work inside of a desktop environment. On iOS, there are some slightly new programming languages that you would need to use, but in the M1 machines, you can actually just download any application, providing that you've made it available within a desktop or a MacBook Pro environment or Mac. Um, so that's some of the benefits in relation to tabs. However, what does get sacrificed is having a bit more personality into your app. So you can see here, it's a bit more custom, maybe not as custom as it can be, but by building this in React Native, you will have less overhead, less initial upfront cost to build this and ship this. And you can continue maintenance in one core area. One of the drawbacks is you lose all the accessibility benefits if you're creating, a custom component. While React Native does have their own, I think native is always the preferred way to go for accessibility. When it comes to also just having support for scaling things like large text, native usually comes with those things baked in. So there are benefits to both. Sometimes it's not always on the designer to make these choices. Sometimes it's just a business decision. A team might not want to maintain two full teams of, an Android team and then an iOS team. Depending on the scale of the feature, the customer base, you will have choices between both. And always good just to know the limitations so that you as a designer, maybe you have to compensate for the accessibility in the more custom experience, or just provide the traits that are available in the native experience. So some takeaways here, just winding down. Quick note again, just to mute if if you did come off mute recently. Maybe Steve, if you're able to, that would be great. Although I do enjoy the background music. So yeah, some quick takeaways here. Best examples of OS guidelines are always the native apps. So if you look at your calendar apps, your mail apps, your camera, these will be the way that OS wants us to be making these components, controls, and using them within our design. You'd want to also consider things that are familiar within the industry. So it's hard to ignore things like WhatsApp, Instagram, especially Discord, and just making sure that there's a healthy balance of heuristics we know and things that have fundamentally changed how we behave with applications, and just keeping that balance in check. It's worth to note that when it comes to accessibility and native patterns, these applications will not always be the go-to. So really important to keep a finger on the OS guidelines, Apple HIG, Google Material, and also WCAG, in order to ensure that your customers are getting the best known heuristics, because they do update every year. It's always hard to know what has been identified as a regression within a company. What you might be experiencing or seeing within your application might actually be 2 or 3 versions behind, or it has been flagged as a regression to be updated later. I don't think I have control, but Steve, if you're able to, if you can hear me and you're able to mute, that would be great. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have control, but I will try to push on here. Not too much left. So embracing both iOS HIG and Material. One thing that is maybe just that might come up is, how do we apply bias or choose when we use iOS or the material design language? Um, Over time, it's something that comes from being a mobile designer. You will see the progression, and also you can read about the reasons why they may upgrade past patterns and why they're introducing new patterns. So over time, this is just something that will you'll get a sense of. But definitely keeping an eye on both is really important. And one example is a float in action button. Material has, they were one of the first to be implemented a float in action button. So they have quite a bit of information on that on their guidelines website. So it's great to keep an eye on both for that kind of reason. So yeah, that brings us to the end here. I hope the close-in moments were made more epic by Steve's background music. But yeah, it'd be great to
May the
provide
goddess
some
protect.
feedback. It'd be great to provide some feedback. Let me know if this was helpful, if it was the level was right, too deep, not too high level. Feel free to request a topic deep dive later, and yeah, also I'm available on LinkedIn if you want to connect there. But yeah, thank you so much for showing up. It was great presenting, and thank you again. We'll see you. Bye bye.